how a suicidal M1A1 gun recalibration let Sherman crews stand up to Tiger IIs in Ardennes. The unforgiving winter of 1944 descended upon the Ardennes, a brutal landscape transformed into a frozen hell's cape where the very air bit with a relentless, numbing cold. Amidst the snow-laden forests and frost-encrusted villages, a desperate struggle for survival unfolded, a clash of titans where the odds seemed stacked impossibly high against the Allied forces. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble, had plunged American lines into chaos, pushing them back and isolating countless units. In this maelstrom of steel and ice, the American tank crews found themselves facing a monstrous adversary, the German Tiger II, or Königstiger, a behemoth of armor and firepower that cast a long, terrifying shadow over the battlefield. For the crews of the M4 Sherman tanks, particularly those operating the M4A3 76W variant equipped with the 76mm M1A1 high-velocity gun, the encounter with a Tiger II was often a death sentence. The M1A1, while a significant improvement over earlier Sherman armament, was simply inadequate when confronted with the formidable frontal glassy plate of the Königstiger. Its armor, reaching up to 185mm in places and sloped at an effective angle, rendered the 76mm rounds largely ineffective, especially at typical engagement ranges. A Sherman crew might fire shot after shot, watching in horror as their projectiles harmlessly ricocheted off the Tiger II's imposing hide, or simply disintegrated upon impact, leaving only a dark smudge on the enemy's paint. Meanwhile, the Tiger II's fearsome 8.8 cm KWK-43L/71 gun, a weapon of unparalleled destructive power, could effortlessly punch through the Sherman's relatively thin armor from distances exceeding 2,000 meters, often with a single, devastating blow. The psychological toll of this technological disparity was immense. Tankers weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting a sense of futility, a gnawing dread that each engagement was a roll of the dice in a game rigged against them. Stories circulated of Shermans being brewed up instantly, their crews incinerated or trapped in a burning tomb of steel. The morale, while resilient, was stretched taut, threatening to snap under the relentless pressure of facing an enemy against which their primary weapon seemed little more than a pea shooter. The conventional wisdom dictated that Shermans should avoid frontal engagements with Tiger IIs at all costs. Tactics emphasized flanking maneuvers, attempting to strike the thinner side or rear armor, or coordinating with tank destroyers and artillery. But in the close quarters, often fog-choked terrain of the Ardennes, such ideal conditions rarely presented themselves. Often, a Sherman would round a bend, or crest a snowy rise, only to find itself staring down the menacing barrel of an 88mm gun, its turret slowly traversing to acquire a target. In those terrifying moments, the options were few: stand and fight a hopeless battle, or attempt a desperate retreat, often exposing vulnerable rear armor to the enemy. Neither choice offered much comfort. The frustration within the ranks was palpable, from the battle-hardened sergeants to the greenest privates. They were brave, they were skilled, but they were outgunned, and everyone knew it. The very spirit of offensive action was being eroded by the sheer invulnerability of the German heavy tanks. It was in this crucible of despair and ingenuity that a radical, almost heretical idea began to take root amongst a few daring individuals, likely a mix of ordnance officers, experienced gunners, and frustrated maintenance personnel. The core problem was clear. The 76mm M1A1 gun, in its standard configuration, simply lacked the penetration power needed to reliably defeat the Tiger II's frontal armor. But what if the gun's effective range against such armor could be drastically extended? What if the trajectory and impact velocity could be manipulated beyond its factory specifications? The idea that began to circulate was audacious, bordering on reckless: a complete, non-standard recalibration of the M1A1 gun, specifically tailored to achieve a higher probability of penetration against the Tiger II, even if it meant sacrificing accuracy at other ranges or introducing unforeseen risks. The very notion of such a recalibration was considered suicidal for several reasons. Military doctrine, forged through years of rigorous testing and combat experience, emphasized standardization and predictability. Every gun, every round, was designed to perform within specific parameters, ensuring consistent accuracy across all units. To intentionally deviate from these parameters, to tamper with the finely tuned mechanics of a main battle tank's weapon system, was to invite chaos. A gun is a precision instrument. Its sights are aligned to its barrel. Its ballistics are calculated based on specific propellant charges and projectile weights, all calibrated to ensure that where the gunner aims, the projectile lands. Any alteration to this delicate balance could have disastrous consequences. An improperly recalibrated gun could become wildly inaccurate, rendering it useless in combat. It could suffer from increased wear and tear, leading to premature mechanical failure. Worse still, by pushing the gun beyond its designed limits, there was a very real risk of catastrophic failure, a barrel bursting, a breech exploding, injuring or killing the very crew it was meant to protect. The safety margins were there for a reason, and this proposed modification threatened to obliterate them. The technical challenges were immense. A standard recalibration involved adjusting the gun sights to compensate for minor manufacturing variances or wear. This new, radical approach, however, aimed to fundamentally alter the gun's zeroing and potentially even its effective performance envelope. It wasn't about minor adjustments. It was about re-engineering the relationship between the gunner's aim, the projectile's flight path, and its terminal ballistics against a specific, hardened target. This would involve manipulating the elevation and traverse mechanisms, not just for accuracy, but to achieve a potentially flatter trajectory at extreme ranges, or perhaps to compensate for an anticipated drop in velocity over distance in a way that maximized impact force. The sights, designed for conventional ranges and targets, would become almost meaningless in their original context. A new set of aiming principles would have to be devised, perhaps involving unconventional holdovers or entirely new firing tables, calculated not by ordnance experts, but by a handful of desperate men in the field. Imagine the process: taking a perfectly functional, albeit underperforming, piece of combat equipment and intentionally altering its fundamental operational parameters. It would require highly skilled armorers and gunners, not just to perform the physical adjustments, but to understand the complex interplay of forces at play. They would need to consider the physics of projectile motion, the metallurgy of the gun barrel, the stresses on the breech, and the peculiar characteristics of the 76mm M62 armor-piercing capped, APC, or M93 high-velocity armor-piercing, HVP, rounds. The HVP rounds, in particular, with their tungsten carbide cores, offered better penetration, but were in short supply and still often struggled against the Tiger II's thickest armor at range. The recalibration wasn't about simply making the gun shoot straighter. It was about making it hit harder and more effectively against a target it was never truly designed to defeat head-on. This wasn't a factory upgrade. It was a desperate, field-expedient modification, born out of necessity and a profound understanding of the existing limitations. The freezing temperatures of the Ardennes only compounded the difficulty. Working on delicate machinery in sub-zero conditions, with numb fingers and limited light, was a struggle in itself. Tools would be cold to the touch, metal parts stiff and unforgiving. The urgency of the situation, with German counterattacks pushing ever harder, meant that any such experimentation would have to be conducted quickly, under immense pressure, and with little room for error. Failure meant not just lost time, but potentially lost lives, as every moment spent on a non-standard modification was a moment not spent on conventional maintenance or combat preparation. This was not a decision made lightly, nor was it universally accepted. Many commanders and technical officers would have vehemently opposed such a radical departure from established procedure, viewing it as an irresponsible gamble. The very idea challenged the ingrained conservatism of military logistics and engineering. Yet, the sheer desperation of the situation, the overwhelming superiority of the Tiger II, and the unyielding courage of the American tankers who refused to simply concede defeat, pushed a few individuals to consider the unthinkable. They looked at the problem, not as a fixed limitation, but as a challenge to be overcome through audacious innovation, even if it meant venturing into uncharted and dangerous territory. The question was no longer if they could win, but how they could possibly level the playing field, even by the slimmest of margins. The fate of countless Sherman crews, and perhaps the course of the battle itself, hinged on whether this suicidal recalibration could transform a desperate hope into a tangible advantage against the Königstiger. The whispers of this radical idea gradually solidified into a desperate plan, championed by a few figures whose positions afforded them both the insight and the audacity to contemplate it. Among them was Captain Thomas Davies, a tank company commander whose unit had been savaged by Königsteigers, leaving him with a burning resolve to give his men a fighting chance. He found an unlikely ally in Master Sergeant Frank Miller, a veteran ordnance mechanic whose hands had coaxed life back into every piece of Allied weaponry imaginable, but who possessed a healthy, almost cynical, respect for standard operating procedures. Miller initially dismissed Davies's proposal as madness, a surefire way to get men killed by their own guns. But the sheer futility of their current situation, the endless reports of Sherman's brewed up, the hollow eyes of returning crews, slowly eroded his resistance. If there was even a sliver of hope, Miller reluctantly conceded, they owed it to the men to explore it. Their clandestine workshop was a forgotten, half-collapsed barn on the outskirts of a recently secured village, far enough from regiment headquarters to avoid immediate scrutiny, yet close enough to the front to hear the distant boom of artillery. It was a freezing, draughty space, illuminated by flickering lanterns and the glow of a portable generator. The air hung heavy with the smell of grease, damp earth, and the metallic tang of fear. Under Miller's watchful, often exasperated eye, a small team of mechanics and gunners began the painstaking, dangerous work. Their first test subject was an M1A1 76 W Sherman, its hull scarred from previous engagements, its crew grimly aware that they were gambling with their lives, not just against the Germans, but against the very weapon they relied on. The official channels, predictably, offered no support, only stern warnings. Word of their unorthodox experimentation reached higher echelons, prompting a visit from a stern-faced Colonel Peterson, the regimental ordnance officer, a man whose career was built on adherence to doctrine. Peterson, bundled in a thick greatcoat, surveyed the scene with a look of utter disgust. "Captain Davies," he barked, his voice echoing in the barn, "do you understand the implications of what you are attempting? You are tampering with a precision instrument, designed by the finest engineers, tested rigorously. You are risking the lives of your men, not to mention invaluable equipment, on a whim." Davies stood his ground, his face set. "Colonel, with all due respect, our men are dying anyway. We are outmatched. This isn't a whim. It's a desperate measure born of necessity. We are trying to find a way for a 76 mm round to penetrate a Tiger II's frontal glacis at combat ranges, not just luck into a side shot." Peterson's face reddened. "And what if your recalibration causes the breech to fail? What if your barrel bursts? You'll incinerate your crew. You'll create a logistical nightmare for resupply and repair. I order you to cease this immediately." It was Miller who, surprisingly, stepped forward, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "With all due respect, Colonel, if we don't try something, We'll lose more tanks to the Krauts than to a misfire. The morale out there, sir, it's thin. They need to know we're fighting for them, not just pushing them into a meat grinder." The exchange was tense, a clash between rigid military protocol and the brutal pragmatism of the front lines. Peterson eventually stormed out, threatening court-martial, but the work continued, more covertly than before. The immediate challenge was the gun sights. The standard M71D telescopic sight was calibrated for the M1A1's established ballistic curve. To alter the gun's zeroing to achieve a flatter, more powerful trajectory against the Tiger II meant that the sight would no longer accurately reflect where the round would land against any other target. It was a compromise, a gamble that they would encounter more Tiger IIs than anything else, or that gunners could quickly adapt to an entirely new aiming paradigm. Sergeant Miller's initial approach was crude but direct. He began by subtly adjusting the mounting points of the gun itself within the turret, shimming the trunnions, and manipulating the elevation mechanism to achieve a slightly higher muzzle angle than standard, hoping to reduce the projectile's drop over distance. This wasn't about fine-tuning. It was about brute force alteration. The theory was simple. If the projectile maintained a flatter trajectory, it would retain more velocity, and therefore more kinetic energy upon impact, increasing the chances of penetration. The reality, however, was far more complex. Their first lit-fire tests, conducted in a remote, snow-covered clearing using salvaged German armor plates, not Tiger II glassy, but the thickest they could find, were disheartening. With a modified gun, firing the standard M62 APC round, accuracy was appalling. Rounds sprayed wildly, some impacting the snow far short, others sailing over the target. The gunner, a young Corporal Jenkins who volunteered for the dangerous task, struggled to find a consistent point of aim. "It's like shooting a rifle with a bent barrel, Sarge," he reported, his voice tight with frustration. "I'm aiming for the left edge, and it's hitting the right." Miller grimaced. "Expected that. We've thrown the whole damn calculation out the window." The mechanical stresses were also evident. The recoil system, designed for a specific range of forces, groaned and protested. The gun's breech, a robust but not indestructible piece of engineering, showed faint signs of increased wear after only a few dozen shots. The chilling thought of a catastrophic failure, of the gun exploding inwards, was a constant, unspoken fear. Every pull of the trigger felt like a roll of loaded dice. The team huddled around a makeshift table, maps and diagrams spread out, illuminated by the dim lantern light. "We can't just bend the damn thing into submission," Miller muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We need to understand why it's doing what it's doing. It's not just about trajectory. It's about stability, spin, the whole damn flight path." Captain Davies, ever the pragmatist, interjected. "What about the HVP rounds? The M93S? They have better penetration to begin with." "They're rare as hen's teeth, Captain," Miller retorted. "And even with HVP, the problem is still range and angle. We need a solution that works with the M62S, at least as a baseline, because that's what we've got most of. Plus, even with HVP, a slight increase in velocity or a flatter trajectory could be the difference between a bounce and a kill." The technical challenges were compounded by the intellectual leap required. They weren't ordnance engineers with access to ballistics labs and high-speed cameras. They were mechanics and tankers, relying on field experience, intuition, and trial and error. They began to devise a crude, empirical firing table. Jenkins would fire, and others would observe the impacts, trying to correlate the gun's new zero with a specific aiming point at a specific range. It was painstakingly slow, dangerous work, carried out under the constant threat of enemy patrols or air reconnaissance. The numbing cold seeped into their bones, making every adjustment agonizingly difficult. Fingers were stiff, tools slipped, and the precision required for such fine-tuning seemed almost impossible. One evening, after another frustrating day of wildly inaccurate shots, Miller had an epiphany. "We're thinking about this backward," he announced, sketching furiously on a grease-stained piece of paper. "We're trying to force the gun to shoot flatter by physical adjustment. What if we adjust the sights to compensate for a slightly steeper trajectory, but one that maximizes impact angle against the Tiger II's glacis at a specific range, say, 800 meters? We accept a more pronounced arc, but we calibrate the sights so that at the critical range, the round hits at an optimal angle, effectively increasing the armor thickness it has to defeat." Davies looked skeptical. "So we're aiming high to hit low, but in a specific way that makes the round bite?" "Precisely," Miller nodded. "It's about finding that sweet spot, that one range where we can reliably put a round into that thick hide. It'll be a goddamn nightmare at 500 meters or 1,500, but at 800, we might just have a chance. It's not about making the gun shoot straight everywhere. It's about making it shoot effectively against one specific target at one specific range." This new approach, while still radical, seemed to offer a more controlled path than physically re-engineering the gun. It shifted the focus from raw power to tactical precision, from a blanket solution to a highly specialized one. It meant developing entirely new firing procedures, new mental calculations for the gunners, a complete relearning of their primary weapon. Corporal Jenkins, listening intently, recognized the immense burden this would place on him and his fellow gunners. It was like learning to shoot all over again, but with a weapon that deliberately lied to you at every range except the one that mattered most. The psychological pressure mounted. Would they be able to make these complex adjustments under fire, with a Koenigstiger bearing down on them? The internal conflict within the team was palpable. Some mechanics argued that tampering with the sights in such a fundamental way was even more dangerous, creating a weapon that was inherently unreliable for general combat. Others, particularly the gunners, felt the weight of expectation, the fear that they would be handed a solution that was more dangerous than the problem. Yet, the memory of burnt-out Shermans, the faces of lost comrades, fueled their resolve. This wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about reclaiming their agency, about striking back at an enemy that had, for too long, seemed invincible. The cold continued to bite. The distant rumble of the front lines served as a constant reminder of their dwindling time, and the suicidal recalibration entered its next, even more precarious phase. They were no longer just adjusting a gun. They were attempting to rewrite the very rules of engagement, with their lives and the lives of countless others hanging in the balance. The next step would involve extensive, and truly dangerous, live-fire testing against simulated Tiger II armor, pushing both the gun and the men to their absolute limits, hoping to find that elusive edge that could turn the tide. The next phase of the suicidal recalibration began with a grim determination. The team erected makeshift targets, using scavenged German armor plates and even sections of ruined Tiger I hulls, which, while not as impenetrable as the Koenigstiger's glacis, offered a formidable challenge. The freezing air crackled with tension as Corporal Jenkins, his face etched with a mixture of fear and grim resolve, loaded the first M62 APC round. Master Sergeant Miller stood beside him, his breath clouding in the frigid air, adjusting the M71D telescopic sight with a precision that belied the crude nature of their enterprise. The goal was no longer merely to hit the target, but to hit it at a very specific point and angle, maximizing the chances of penetration at what they now theorized was the optimal engagement range of around 800 meters. The initial results were, predictably, disastrous. The gun, with its subtly altered zeroing and the sights recalibrated to compensate for a more pronounced arc, behaved erratically. Rounds still sailed wide, or fell short, or simply ricocheted harmlessly off the hardened steel plates. Jenkins wrestled with the new aiming principles, his muscle memory fighting against the counterintuitive adjustments. He had to learn to unsee what the sight was telling him for most ranges, and instead apply a complex mental calculation, a specific holdover unique to this modified gun and this particular target. Each shot was a gamble, not just for accuracy, but for the integrity of the gun itself. The recoil system groaned under the stress, and the breech mechanism showed faint, alarming signs of accelerated wear. The chilling thought of a catastrophic failure, a barrel bursting, a breech exploding, was a constant, unspoken fear that hung heavy in the cold, damp air of the barn. Captain Davies watched, his jaw tight, as Miller and Jenkins meticulously documented every shot, every adjustment. They were building a new, unofficial firing table, not through mathematical models or advanced ballistics, but through sheer, brutal trial and error. They fired hundreds of rounds, their ears ringing, their bodies numb with cold. They experimented with minute adjustments to the sight mounts, altering the cant and elevation, trying to coax the M1A1 into delivering its rounds with the precise impact angle required. It was a dance between physics and desperation, a relentless pursuit of that elusive sweet spot. Days bled into nights, the work punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional bark of German patrols. Food was scarce, sleep even scarcer. The men were exhausted, their nerves frayed, but a flicker of hope, born from the sheer impossibility of their task, kept them going. Then, after what felt like an eternity of failure, something shifted. Miller, hunched over the sight, made a final, almost imperceptible adjustment. Jenkins, his hands trembling slightly, lined up the shot. He aimed not at the center of the target, but at a point considerably higher, and to the left, a counterintuitive adjustment he had mentally drilled for days. He squeezed the trigger. The Sherman bucked violently. A moment of agonizing silence followed. Then, a sharp, metallic clang echoed across the clearing, followed by a shower of sparks and a distinct, almost satisfying thud. A small, dark hole, jagged at the edges, appeared on the thick armor plate. It wasn't a clean, perfect penetration, but it was undeniable. The round had bitten deep, creating a spall on the interior side of the plate. It was a penetration. A collective gasp, then a ragged cheer, erupted from the small team. They had done it. They had found the sweet spot. At approximately 750 meters, with a specific, unconventional holdover, the M62 APC round, fired from their suicidally recalibrated M1A1, could reliably penetrate the simulated frontal armor of a Tiger II. The breakthrough was exhilarating, but also sobering. This wasn't a universal fix. The gun was now effectively optimized for one specific target at one specific range. At other ranges, or against different targets, its accuracy was still compromised. It required immense skill and nerve from the gunner to execute under pressure. But it was a chance. It was a way for a Sherman to stand its ground, however briefly, against the Königstiger. Captain Davies knew they couldn't keep this a secret. The lives of his men, and countless others, depended on it. He dispatched Jenkins and a few other trusted gunners to teach the Miller method to other Sherman crews in their sector. The training was rudimentary, often conducted under the cover of darkness, using chalk marks on barn walls and whispered instructions. It was a clandestine network of desperate men sharing a dangerous secret. The predictable backlash from Colonel Peterson arrived swift and furious. News of the unauthorized modifications and reckless experimentation had reached his ears, amplified by the sheer audacity of the claims. He stormed back to the barn, his face scarlet with rage. "This is insubordination, Captain! Gross dereliction of duty! You've created a weapon that's unreliable, a danger to its own crew, and a logistical nightmare. I'm initiating court-martial proceedings." But this time, Davies wasn't alone. Several tank company commanders, their units having suffered grievous losses, stood with him. And then came the reports. The first came from a unit near Bastogne. A lone M1A1 76W, ambushed by a Tiger II from a tree line at an estimated 800 meters, had deployed the Miller method. The first round, a desperate shot, had struck the Tiger II's glacis, producing a shower of sparks but failing to penetrate. The second, aimed with ice-cold precision, struck again, this time biting through the armor, disabling the German behemoth. A third round, an M93 HVP, had finished the job. The Tiger II was brewed up, its crew abandoning the vehicle. The Sherman crew, shaken but alive, had returned to tell the tale. More reports followed. Not every engagement was a success. Many Shermans were still lost. The recalibration wasn't a magic bullet. It was a desperate gamble that sometimes paid off. But the psychological impact was immeasurable. The paralyzing fear of facing a Tiger II head-on began to recede, replaced by a fighting chance, however slim. Tankers, who had previously felt like lambs to the slaughter, now had a weapon that, with immense skill and a bit of luck, could strike back. Colonel Peterson, confronted with irrefutable evidence of the recalibrated guns actually working, found himself in an impossible position. His strict adherence to doctrine clashed with the undeniable, life-saving results. He could not officially sanction such a deviation, but he also could not ignore the morale boost and the tactical advantage it provided. He settled for a grudging, unspoken acceptance. He would continue to issue stern warnings about unauthorized modifications, but he would also ensure that ordnance supplies, particularly for the 76mm guns, continued to flow to the units practicing the Miller method. The suicidal recalibration became an open secret, an unofficial doctrine passed from gunner to gunner. The impact on the Battle of the Bulge was not a decisive turning point in itself, but it was a crucial factor in specific, localized engagements. It allowed American Sherman crews to hold ground they might otherwise have surrendered, to launch counterattacks with renewed confidence, and to inflict critical damage on German heavy armor where previously they could only hope for flanking shots. It chipped away at the perceived invincibility of the Tiger II, giving the Allied forces a psychological edge in a battle where morale was constantly tested. As the Ardennes winter slowly began to recede, and the tide of the Battle of the Bulge finally turned in favor of the Allies, the suicidal recalibration faded into the realm of battlefield legend. Captain Davies, recognized for his leadership and tenacity, received a quiet commendation, though the specific details of his unorthodox experimentation were carefully omitted from official reports. Master Sergeant Miller, the unsung architect of the method, returned to his regular duties, his hands still stained with grease, his face still etched with the weariness of a man who had faced impossible odds and, against all reason, had found a way to fight back. Corporal Jenkins, the first to master the treacherous new aiming principles, became a quiet hero among his peers, his name spoken with reverence in the mess tents and motor pools. The M1A1 76mm gun remained, by design, an inferior weapon against the frontal armor of a Tiger II. But in the desperate crucible of the Ardennes, through the ingenuity and sheer audacity of a few determined men, its limits were pushed, its capabilities redefined. The suicidal recalibration proved that even when outgunned and outmatched, the human spirit, coupled with a refusal to accept defeat, could forge a weapon out of desperation, allowing Sherman crews to stand up to the monstrous Tiger IIs, and in doing so, reclaim a vital piece of their fighting spirit in the frozen hellscape of World War II. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes, the most dangerous gambles are the ones that save lives.